Hi, I'm Mimi Chan. Welcome to Culture Chat. Thanks for joining the conversation. Patti Brigham is a grassroots leader and the president of the League of Women Voters of Florida. In 2016, in the days following the mass shooting at the Pulse Nightclub in Orlando, Patti partnered with former League President Pam Goodman to form the Florida Coalition to Prevent Gun Violence, which now includes more than 100 organizational partners. We discuss her passion for activism and the incredible work she is doing to combat voter suppression during this very critical time. I truly enjoy these conversations and hope you do too. If you are, please share this podcast with others and rate it on your platform of choice. If you'd like to take one extra step to help keep this podcast going, you can donate to the show on my website or patreon.com/SifuMimiChan. You can donate as little as $1 per month. I would appreciate it. Thank you so much for the support. For comments or suggestions, email me at mimi@culturechatpodcast.com or reach out on social media at SifuMimiChan. Now, on with the show. Hello, Patti. Thank you so much for joining me on Culture Chat today.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
Yes. Well, it's, about time that we sat down and had a discussion. I have heard so many wonderful things about the work you do with, the League of Women Voters, but we just got the chance to work together on the Orange County Citizen Safety Task Force.
We did, and that was an amazing experience.
Yes, well, it seems like you are constantly doing community and public service and just how much time do you have in the day? You seem very, very busy.
Well, it depends on the time of year. Last year, of course, was a major election year, and we had to get the vote out under COVID-19. So that was very intense. We had to adjust everything we did to Zoom and send voters to online platforms. The leagues is Vote 411 to register to vote. We did massive campaigns on get your ballot early, vote by mail, put it in a Dropbox. And so my days were, very long, from early in the morning until sometimes late at night. And then right now, we're in the midst of the legislative session. So I would say I'm currently working about 60 hours a week.
Oh my goodness. Well, hopefully you'll be getting a well-deserved rest soon, but I would love to actually just hear a little bit more about it because I think a lot of our listeners have heard of this infamous League of Women Voters, but I don't think people really know exactly what it is. It's kind of this, this organization that has been around for such a long time and people know about it, but I don't think they really know about it. So I would love for you to kind of educate us.
Well, the League of US formed 101 years ago, and it came out of the women's right to vote. The League's mission is protecting democracy and defending voting rights. And it was like that then, and we're still protecting voting rights because we're seeing an assault on our voting rights, all voting rights. But it did come out of the women's right to vote. And then, so that's the National League. And then there are leagues in all states. And Florida has a very powerful, I must say, league. We have 29 local leagues from Pensacola down to the Keys. And they're their own sort of independent charters, but they are under the league umbrella, the state league umbrella, rather, as the state league is under the US League umbrella. So at the state level, we work on issues such as legislation, state policy, sometimes getting involved in litigation, and just a massive amount of work. We developed from going to just a voting rights organization, which is our core mission, to working on a number of issues, the environment, healthcare, education, immigration, gun violence prevention, and I'm sure I'm leaving some out. Good governance is part of our core mission. So we have many members who work on a variety of these things. Like I just mentioned, juvenile justice is another one. And so we're heavily involved in local communities and at the state level.
Yeah. And how do you basically one is how do people get involved, right? So I think right off the bat, usually I wait till the end for this, but I think this is something where people feel passionate about all of those things you just listed. Like everyone's probably going, yeah, that and that and that. And I think this is one of those organizations that, like you said, you have a core, and I'd love to dive into that a little bit more in a second. But like, how can people get involved? Is this a volunteer thing, or is there actual like job applications? And just let us know more about that process.
Sure. Well, we're an all volunteer organization except for our small staff, which are headquartered in Orlando. And yeah, we have thousands of volunteers around the state. It's very easy to get plugged in. There are local leagues, as I mentioned, right here in Orange County. We have a very large league. So if you're interested in getting involved in the league, all you have to do is join. You can go to our state website to find out if there's a local league in your area, or you can join via our state website, LWVFL.org. It's very easy. There is an annual membership fee, but once you join, you can get as involved as you want, or you can just be a supporter. But some of us, once we joined, we got very involved. And so I will say that the league volunteers that I've met and worked with, many work harder because they care so passionately about this work and they're doing it for free.
Mhm.
So that makes a difference, the passion and the commitment.
Yeah, and so that takes me to, of course, your journey to where you are in the league today, but also, just as a local activist and just a community public servant, you do so many things, like we discussed off air. So, how did you kind of get involved, and when did that kind of spark ignite for you?
Well, you know, I didn't set out on a path to get involved at the level I did, but I see now throughout my life that all paths led me here. That everything I did prepared me, even though I didn't know it, to become the league's state president. But as far as specifically with the league, I had in 2012, and I must add that the league is nonpartisan. We don't take positions on candidates or political party, but we do take strong policy positions after study and reaching consensus. But anyway, in 2012, I was volunteering to phone bank on a political campaign. I was not a league member, but I met some amazing women who were in the league and said to me, "You really need to join the League of Women Voters." So one of them took me to a luncheon where there were a number of speakers. This was in early 2013. I was welcomed and I joined that day, and then I quickly got involved with some local committees and I got very interested. I attended a meeting where the social policy chair talked about here's what we're working on, and one of them was one of the things was the Affordable Care Act. And she said we really need to be doing something on gun violence prevention, but we really haven't gotten it off the ground. And I will tell you, Mimi, when I heard that, I felt like a 90 to 100 or more light bulbs went off inside my body. And I thought and felt to my very core being, that is what I meant to do. And I always knew that I would be a good activist. I just hadn't met the issue. So I approached her and then the co-presidents of that league and said I'd like to try to do something. So I formed a subcommittee. We called it the gun safety as opposed to gun control. And we started out with a group of like 5 to 6 of us. Then 4 months later, the president at that time, Deirdre McNabb, asked me to hold a caucus in Tallahassee at our lobby days. We did. It became a statewide committee and went from there. And then in 2016, right after the Pulse shooting at the nightclub in Orlando, we formed, or we co-founded, along with a very good partner of ours in New York, the Campaign to Keep Guns Off Campus, the Florida Coalition to Prevent Gun Violence, which is still going and is an independent coalition now of over 100 organizational partners. And the fight continues to ban assault weapons, to bring more common sense gun legislation to the state. So that is how I got involved. And I spent 2 years on the board of Orange County's League. In 2015, I was asked to join the state board. And so this year I will have been on the state board for 6 years. 2 of those years I was the first vice president, and then almost 3 years now I have been the state president. So it was a rather quick trajectory that I never would have imagined would happen when I joined the league as a regular volunteer. It's just been quite a journey, I have to tell you.
Yeah. And, I want to talk a little bit about the core of it, which of course is how it began with the voter rights, and the fact that especially now in this past several years, I've been seeing so many things in the news about that voter suppression and all of the issues from last year. And, from a personal standpoint, my parents are both immigrants, and so they weren't always voters. And so I was never raised with that, hey, as soon as you turn 18, that's the first thing you need to do is register to vote. So I always share my embarrassment of what I believe to be an issue in the I believe it's the 2000 election. And I blame myself where, Florida was tied up, and there's so much that I learned from that, and it painfully so, but of course this is how we learn, right? And this is how we grow. And of course we're all voters now, and we all are on board, and we all are trying to learn. But I think it's one of those things, especially for different communities, that it's not a priority, because in other countries it's mandatory. You get fined if you don't show up to do it, and so there's so many different ways that this works. And so here in this country, why do you think it is that voting doesn't seem to be as big of a priority as it needs to be? I mean, maybe you even know the statistics, like what percentage of the country actually votes or anything like that.
Well, we had a huge turnout in 2020. It was historic.
Yes.
I don't want to paint with too broad a brush, Mimi. Mm-hmm. I think that there are super voters. There are Americans that are committed to voting every year. We're seeing more young people registering to vote. You can register at 16 to be ready to vote at 18. The Trump, and of course we're always educating on the elections, what's involved, all the pieces of how you can vote. Voting is very easy to do in Florida. You can vote by mail, you can vote at the early vote sites, you can put your ballot in the drop box, or you can wait till election day and vote in person. But those voting rights are under attack right now. We've got a couple of bills moving through the legislature that would dramatically change vote by mail. One of them would completely eliminate the drop boxes, which 1.5 million voters in Florida used last year. We are very concerned about that. And actually, hundreds of bills in 43 states have been introduced that would frankly suppress voting rights. And this is a byproduct, I believe, of what you have when you have a one-party control that has very different values from the opposite party. Now, we have a one-party control in Florida. And yes, we're nonpartisan, but we believe in parity in the legislature and certainly in the cabinet. Now, you're not as likely to get it in the cabinet because whoever the governor is going to want his own people, right? Mm-hmm. Although some of them are elected. But in the legislature, we currently have a one-party control in both the House and the Senate. And so there's no equity excuse me, when it comes to issues. It's the priorities of the one party that are getting the bills moving and that are getting them passed. Now, this attack on voting rights is extremely unsettling, and it's chilling. And a lot of it came out, frankly, because of the disinformation that was spread by our former president, particularly in 2020. The claims of fraud regarding vote by mail, even though he voted by mail, that it goes to show you, when you have so many Americans or Floridians who bought that disinformation campaign, it shows you how dangerous disinformation is. We have extremely little fraud has been shown, or it's been shown by various studies that there's extremely little fraud nationwide when it comes to vote by mail. Mm-hmm. So these untruths that were spread, your vote by mail ballots are going to wind up in creeks, rivers, mm-hmm. All this stuff, it was just nonsense. But we are now seeing that those types of myths, I'll put it that way, have consequences. And so I can't read the minds of those who would try to suppress the vote, but we do believe that people of color are at risk for having their voting rights suppressed. And that has long been an issue in this country. We're afraid that they're moving backwards, not forwards. Let's not move backwards and make it harder for people to vote. Let's move forward and make it easier. Mm-hmm. Our governor, after the election, said, we had a great election in 2020. It's just perfect. However, we need election reform. And that makes no sense whatsoever. Mm-hmm. Why do you change something that's working, that is a solution in search of a problem? Mm-hmm. So we are very concerned about this, as are communities of color, because they stand to be highly impacted. And so we're doing everything we can right now to educate the public and to fight these awful bills. And it's not just in Florida. Like I said, Mimi, it's across the country. And you have a political party who wants to stay in power, apparently, no matter what.
Yeah. And what's so dangerous, you use the right word. It's so dangerous to have so much disinformation, because there are people, obviously, after what we saw in January, that really believe this election wasn't valid. And it doesn't matter what the facts are. It just matters what they believe. And it really is an attack on our democracy. And I know that's unpopular to say, because people are like, oh, once you start saying that, you're just a conspiracy theorist or something. But it's actually shocking that in this last year, from last year to now, where we are with how people feel about the vote and how people feel about voting. And like you said, the voter turnout was historical. And the vote by mail, I've honestly always voted by mail, because I often am out of the country at the time, or I'm traveling, or I'm away. And so I want to make sure I don't miss it, because I don't know when I'm going to be where. And I always found it to be a very reliable way. And I think it also makes it convenient, and it should be something that is easier to do versus, oh, I have to take off a day of work, I won't get paid that day, I'm not going to be able to go. And there's so many deterrents and roadblocks already. And so I can only imagine what it's like to be you with your team in just an uphill battle all the time. Like, is there any point where it's gotten any easier, or is it just constantly an uphill battle? Because it just feels like, wow, we're, like you said, we're rolling backwards, and it's got to be frustrating.
Well, I don't think we've seen a legislative session quite like this one. Mm. First of all, we're still under the pandemic. And so the Capitol is basically empty, because they're limiting traffic through that Capitol, human traffic, you know what I'm saying? Because you usually have those halls filled with lobbyists and visitors and, tourists and activists. But right now, out of precaution, they're limiting that. We understand that. But there's also another problem, and that is the lack of transparency. If you want to testify, and any member of the public can testify before a committee on a bill that is concerning to them, or maybe they're in favor of it.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to testify before the Senate, you have to go over to the Civic Center, which is, I guess, about 10 minutes from the Capitol, and wait in another room till you're called to be given 30 seconds to 1 minute to testify virtually. And then in the House, they are holding hearings in some large committee rooms, and there is social distancing, and people are wearing masks. But I was watching one of the committee hearings the other day, and the committee chair said, if you want to take your mask off at the mic when you testify, you certainly can, but we're not disinfecting the microphone after each speaker. So
Wow.
that was pretty amazing. So it's almost as if they're using the pandemic to limit public testimony, because the members of the public who usually make the drive up or down to Tallahassee, and it's quite a trek, aren't going as much because of COVID. And Leon County, I believe, has had some pretty high numbers. I don't know where they are now, but we are just absolutely outraged by the lack of transparency that we're seeing, and making it harder for the public to testify.
Yeah. This is very predatorial, like basically, the wounded animal is already wounded and they're just going in for the kill. Like you said, they're really taking advantage of a really horrible situation. And I think there was that silver lining of, wow, because of COVID, we had so many voter by mail, and now people know about this. And there was this great momentum of excitement. And then, like you said, the disinformation campaign began, where people aren't sure if their vote counted, and because
their vote did count.
Yes.
I mean, you asked me for some numbers. Statewide turnout in 2020 was 77%. That was as high as it has been in 65 years.
Wow.
And that's because nearly 6 million Floridians signed up to vote by mail. Now, that doesn't just mean that they stuck their ballot to the post box. Many of them put it in the drop box, 1.5 million. There was no cheating, no fraud, no problems with voter rolls. So we had a good election. The Republicans won the state, and the Democrats lost the state, but the process was very good for them too. The process worked. Florida put on a model election, and that's something, of course, that many news outlets had their eyes on us, because that has not necessarily been the case in the past. So this last year, our supervisors of elections, 67 of them, with our many, many poll workers and election protections workers, who are to be commended, because many of them went out and worked the polls in a pandemic to make sure that we put on a fair election, and we did. Mm-hmm. So to have our state officials turn around and try to limit vote by mail by saying, well, if you want to vote by mail, we're going to increase the number of times you have to request that every year. And one of the bills, Senate Bill 90, would completely eliminate those ballot drop boxes. The other bill, which is a proposed committee bill that just came out of the House last week, would not eliminate the drop boxes, but would make them it would be a requirement that they were guarded 24/7. And if you go and drop your ballot off there, and many people choose the drop boxes because, first of all, you don't have to have a stamp on that ballot. Yeah. You sign and seal it and deliver it, drop it in. So it's a convenient way to do it. And now, under this bill, if it passes, these boxes would have to be guarded at all times. Many of them already are, but you would have to show your identification when you dropped your ballot in. That's currently not the case. I mean, when you put your ballot in a post box, a postal service box, you have to show your identification. You know, if you're voting, if you're a registered voter, your signature is on file with your local supervisor of elections. What you always need to do is make sure that your signature matches with what's on file at the SOE's office, because as we get older, our signatures change.
Mm-hmm.
And also, there are some illnesses like Parkinson's disease that could cause your hand to shake. So we always educate the public to make sure their signatures match. But these complications that the legislature are trying to instill on the voters don't make sense, and we believe it's a form of voter suppression.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Just for education, where and how do you make sure that what you have on file matches? Is what does one do to ensure that?
Right. Well, when you register to vote, your signature that you sign up to register usually is the one that's on your driver's license. Usually that's the match,
Mm-hmm.
or a state issued identification card if you don't have a driver's license.
Okay.
So say you vote by mail and you sign that ballot and you sign the back of the envelope. If the supervisors see that what they have on file doesn't match, they usually will reach out to the voter and say, you need to update your signature.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there wasn't a whole lot of it's called curing. There wasn't a whole lot of that necessary. And I believe that's because last year, there was such a huge campaign to educate the voters about signatures.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, this whole notion of ballot harvesting, we haven't had a problem in Florida. One of the things that this House bill seeks to do is currently, if you have family members or friends that want their ballots, their signed sealed ballots in an envelope delivered to the drop box, you can take them and drop them off in the drop box. If you want to take them to the supervisor's office, you have to have an affidavit. Well, what this bill seeks to do is you only can drop off a ballot for an immediate family member. Now, what if your immediate family member is in another county?
Mm-hmm.
What if your mother lives up in the Panhandle and you live in South Florida? What is she supposed to do if she is immobile in a nursing home or a retirement facility and is unable to go and drop off her own ballot? It just doesn't make sense to create that kind of obstacle. And it's very troubling.
Yeah. And so what can us as citizens do who don't agree with this suppression and all these bills are being passed? And you're right. I'm passionate, but I'm not driving to Tallahassee. I mean, we talked earlier about how many hours of the day we have. And but what can we do? Are there things we can be doing? People we could be calling?
Oh, absolutely. Well, first of all, if you're a league member, when we see bills moving and really moving in danger of passing. Also, I should add that there are good bills, they're not all bad, that we get behind. Mm-hmm. But these voter suppression bills and some other bills like this anti-protest bill, House Bill 1, which is poised to go to the floor this week. I'm not sure when this is going to air, but it may have already gone to the time it does. But we will put out action alerts, and they go to all of our members across the state saying, here are all the email addresses of the committee members. Here are all the phone numbers of their offices. Please call or email and tell them to vote this bill down. If the bill's poised to go to the floor, we ask our members to focus on the legislators in their district. Let them know you're a constituent, because it's the constituents that can vote them in or out. So we get our members engaged that way. We also ask them to write letters to the editor. guest op-eds, and many, many of them do that. And of course, the State League is very active getting the word out via the media, both newspaper and broadcast.
Yeah, so it is important to be as vocal and as involved as possible because I think a lot of people feel like, well, what's one phone call going to do, or what's one, I try to sign up for as many newsletters, and then the ACLU will send me a thing and sign this petition or whatever, and a lot of people do it. A lot of people just feel like, does it really matter? Is it making a difference? So, how do you maybe connect that for people so that they realize that all actions that will that energy will go into the right place and that it does make a difference?
Well, they add up. When we hear from legislators that they've, I received 400 phone calls today, in half a day, for example. Public pressure can work, and it's worked in the past. We've helped defeat bills that were very dangerous. For example, there were bills moving through the legislature year after year that would have put firearms onto college and university campuses from concealed permit holders. We are very opposed to that, and we don't believe that's the environment where guns belong. So we fought those bills through the means I was telling you about, as well as through lobbyists working the halls of the Capitol, and we defeated them. So public pressure can work. And the thing to keep in mind is you have the power as a voter. Voting is your greatest way to lift your voice as a citizen. It is the greatest way to protest, frankly, is through the ballot. That is who you're voting for is going to shape the future of, say, for example, if it's a local races are extremely important because they shape the way your community is going to work, your county commission, your city council, your school board. Then the state legislature is going to shape the way the state operates. The greatest thing a citizen can do is vote. Voting matters. Elections have consequences. We need more people voting. If you're not happy with what you're seeing come out of Tallahassee or Washington, the best means you have to change it is to vote.
Well said. We are speaking during Women's History Month. Now, I know that we said we don't know when this is going to air, and there has been a lot going on in the last several weeks. So not quite sure that I have the answer to that as well. But it is currently Women's History Month. And, I wanted to address one is, of course, you being historic and working what you're doing. I want to congratulate you and thank you for that. But also last year, I know, was the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, which should probably be very close and dear to you. I'd love for you to speak a little bit about not just the voters' rights, but specifically the journey for women and what that kind of really means, and what that milestone meant for you personally, especially doing the work you're doing and just kind of being able to take that moment to recognize we have come a long way. We still have a long way to go, but being able to have those small wins and celebratory moments, I think, is what helps kind of keep us going. Otherwise, it could be all gloom and doom. So maybe you could speak a little bit about that.
Absolutely. Well, it was a hard fought battle for women to get the right to vote in this country. And think about it. Hundreds of years, women could not cast their ballot. Many think about, the suffrage movement is, women walking in the parades with the white dresses. Well, guess what? That's very cosmetic, and it was a lot more down and dirty. It was committed activists who fought. Some of them were tortured. Some of them were jailed. At the time, this was radical, and these women were fearless. And we have to remember that it was a hard-won battle. And that these women put their lives on the line. Susan B. Anthony, for example, they put their lives on the line and should be remembered not just as older ladies who wanted to get the women's vote. No, they were warriors. They need to be remembered that way, as absolutely fearless warriors. And they kicked off the tradition of women, woman power, frankly. And we've seen that tradition continue through the years. We remember the women's movement of the late 60s and 1970s about the Equal Rights Amendment, which still has not been ratified, and equal rights for women. I mean, it was an incredible movement. Equal pay is still something that we're fighting for. So yes, we've come a long way, but we do have a long way to go. But I will say that in remembering the pioneers who fought for the right to vote, we have to remember that they really risked their lives to do it.
Yeah, I loved your depiction of them as warriors because you're right. I shamefully shared, well, my first image that pops into my head is that Mary Poppins scene of the sash and that whole bit, because I think that was probably my first exposure, and a conversation I had with Susan Ware, who authored a book on this. She's a historian, said that's many people's first impression, first thought. And you're right. I think we need to rewrite that and re-educate people on that, so they realize that it was not just, hey, let me hand out these leaflets. Their lives were at risk, and it was brutal. And I was, like I said, I enjoy doing these podcasts. I enjoy doing all these things that we've been learning about, because I get to learn. And, being in the task force with you and all of that, it's always a learning experience. And one of the things that really resonated with me as I reflected on our discussion and what we were going to talk about was that, especially with all the social unrest from last year with the murder of George Floyd, and that conclusion, hopefully coming soon, and seeing what happens with that. And lately, of course, with all of the anti-Asian hate crimes, there's just been so much happening with social unrest. And I know that there is a resounding theme that intertwines even that suffrage movement and that racism, as well as the protests and social unrest. Like, it is not exclusive. Like, it's very intersectional, and I think people don't realize how intersectional that is. And you could probably speak a little more to that, because I was reading some books, and I was surprised even how interwoven, and how many African American women had to also fight and stand up with the suffrage movement, and how intersectional that all was. And it's fascinating, as someone who I like to think I'm an activist and try to be, and it's just fascinating to kind of learn about. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that, because it's so relevant. We've got social unrest, and we've got voter suppression, and it's happening at the same time.
Well, the early women's rights pioneers, and even those in the early days of the League of Women Voters, they weren't perfect. Black women who wanted to march in the parades with suffragettes were told to go to the back. How is that any different from telling Rosa Parks to go to the back of the bus? It's not. So there was a lot of reckoning about that over the years. And a few years ago, the League of US and the League of Florida followed and put together a diversity, equity, and inclusion policy to stop this kind of siloing of people of color. Look, I mean, we're all equal. We don't believe that we should view one race over another, one gender over another. Unfortunately, this country was founded on the backs of slaves. That's a fact. And I think what we're seeing is a reckoning in the streets, especially of America, and it was parts of the globe, after the brutal murder of George Floyd. And of course, there have been other brutal murders of Black men by police. I'm not painting police with a broad brush. There are many good law enforcement officers. But unfortunately, there are some bad apples, just like there are in any profession. That brutalization, I think there was a tipping point. And we saw thousands and thousands of citizens take to the streets. And many of them were white, saying, this is enough, enough with this racism in this country. And unfortunately, many of those protesters were met with tear gas. And some of the protests turned ugly. But if you think about it, some of the most progressive movements that have led to positive change have come out from the power of peaceful protest. The civil rights movement of the 60s, led largely by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Those were peaceful protests. They stayed above the fray, and we know that they were fire hosed. There were German shepherds, threatening these protesters. They kept it peaceful. That's why it worked. And we believe in that First Amendment right of assembly and peaceful protest. And that's how change can often happen. And not just change on civil rights, but those passionate about the environment. They want to protest that there's a, sewage treatment plant being put on precious lands. They have every right to do it. And I don't know if I'm directly answering your question, but I've kind of gotten into this bent because there's this bill going through our legislature that would create draconian penalties if you go to a protest that turns, say you go to a protest, it's peaceful, you're with some friends, you are all marching, chanting, doing what you do when you march through the streets protesting. For example, I went to the Women's March. Huge march, hundreds of thousands of women, peaceful protest. Say you go to a protest, somebody throws a rock, hits a nearby window and smashes it. Suddenly that protest is deemed non-peaceful. You and your friends, even though you have done nothing wrong, you didn't throw the rock, can be scooped up and put into jail along with everyone else, even though you were not at fault. So that we believe is unconstitutional, and we are fighting that legislation. So, but to go back to the intersectionality of what you're talking about, it's just like that Citizens Task Force that you and I were on in Orange County. The beauty of that task force was that it was so intersectional. You had different genders, people of color, white people, people from all walks of life, coming together to try to solve a rash of gun crime in parts of the county. That's the way it should work. Not necessarily these silos where we're only staying with those who are who look like us or who have backgrounds like us. No, we need to be open to everybody and work with all of those who want the common good.
Yeah, I agree. And I think I'd love to actually talk about that for the last few minutes, a little bit about that experience that you and I had, because it was such a unique one. Again, it was the first time I was involved in something, with on a Orange County government level and being on a task force. And I'll tell a quick funny story. My mom told my aunt, and my cousin called me, and she's like, oh my gosh, my mom said she's joining the task force. Isn't that dangerous? She thought I was joining like the SWAT team or something. But it does sound very, official. And but what was really cool about it, like we were talking off air, was that they had these different committees, and then we'd have, the large group meeting where we'd find out what everyone was doing. But we found that there was just so much overlap. You can't talk about prevention without intervention, and you can't talk about, intervention without addressing the enforcement committee. And so there was, prevention, intervention, enforcement, and um, prosecution, right, which is the final thing. And so which is your committee. And so it was fascinating to learn about. What do you take away from that experience? Because I know you've been involved in a lot of other committees and organizations before, but how did you find that to be, I guess, I mean, I know you just shared about the intersectionality, but what did you kind of take away from it?
Well, I love meeting people had not yet met or come across because they were, working on the ground in certain pockets of the county. And I had not had the opportunity to cross paths with them. I found that an incredibly wonderful experience. And I learned a lot from them.
Yeah. And do you think, because you and I were talking earlier, like basically our job was to come up with a plan to decrease gun violence in communities that are experiencing so much death and so much just horrible, like what was it, 2-year-olds and just young children being murdered. And so do you feel like what we did is going to change things?
I hope so. I mean, it's going to take a long time. This isn't a sprint. This is an ultra marathon and more.
Yeah.
But you got to start somewhere. And I believe this task force had some courageous conversations. Some of them were difficult conversations. People were passionate because this is a very tough issue, dealing with youth-oriented gun crime. That's very troubling. But the way I think this task force showed the way to do it, which is to bring people together from all walks of life with different life experiences and to share and learn from each other. And by having those conversations and by learning from some of the experts, say law enforcement or attorneys, and then those activists on the ground who are working with troubled youth through their church. We had a number of faith leaders on the panel or on the task force. Then you have the opportunity to really brainstorm and share experiences and views and perspectives that you might not have thought about before, and come up with recommendations on ways to begin chipping away at gun crime. It's going to take time, but for me, it was incredibly fulfilling because it was at the local level where you can really make an impact in your neighborhoods and community. And that's where it all begins. I can't emphasize that enough. It all begins locally. I often hear, well, why should I vote in the local races? Well, why? Because they impact your schools, your neighborhoods, everything about your daily life in your local community. So they're critical.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up, because I think that's something that's overlooked, because we always see, the midterms are overlooked compared to, the big presidential. And while of course it is important, I think people, myself included, I had to learn how important it was that we needed to make sure we were voting in the midterms and on a local level. And, I'm one of those OCD people. So when I get my ballot, I go to your site, I go to all these other sites, I try to read about every person and what they voted for, what they've done. And it's a lot of work. So I am grateful for organizations like yours that do help make it easier by putting information out there, because, when first time voters go in, I think they just think it's going to be like 5 things. Oh, who's the president? Who's the so-and-so? And then there's all these other articles and legislature. And it's hard. Sometimes you read it and you're like, wait, I'm for this, but the way it's worded, is it, it can be very confusing. So you almost have to research before you go to vote.
Right.
But I'm glad you brought that up.
Well, we put out a voter guide every election season, and there are often amendments that are on the ballot, and we research those amendments carefully. We bring on a retired journalist to do the research and analyze them. And then the state board takes a position on the amendments, for or against or neutral.
Mhm.
And people turn to our voter guide to better understand the amendments. We also have candidate questions. We don't endorse candidates, but we do ask the candidates running questions on the relevant topics of the day. And so, yeah, our aim is to educate the voters, because an educated voter is a responsible voter.
Absolutely. And I loved what you said earlier about why the task force was the way to do something, which was bringing together different people with ideas. I mean, I almost feel like that could be said for any of the issues that are happening now, like even in your home, like amongst your family, like you guys having this conversation and being able to be transparent and try to come up with solutions versus just grumbling about problems. And so I agree with you. I think it was a really fantastic experience. We're sitting here because of that experience,
That's
because
right.
I was like down the table, B to C. We sat alphabetically. So we were like just down like at school again. I was like, oh,
That's right.
Patty's right over there. But I wonder though, because you've been fighting and always working towards a goal that may, like you said, not be short term. Sometimes it is a long term. Of course, if a bill is coming out, like that's kind of short term, you need to work on that right away. But you're still working on voter suppression, on still getting equality for women and pay and equality in so many different areas. Like perhaps the question of, do you think it'll make a difference? You're a lot more hopeful because you do know and believe that every inch forward does add up, just like every vote adds up. Like I think you've been able to see the results of it, but a lot of us are just so impatient that if it's not now and if it's not tomorrow, we can't kind of have that vision of like, no, everything we do, every action we take will add up and it will make a difference in the future. And even if it's not for you, for your kids or for other generations and other people. And I think that's something really important. And I love that you kind of bring that perspective, because it's important to feel hopeful, especially in a time where there's so much going on. Everybody had the challenging year of COVID. There's been social unrest. People are struggling, right? There's evictions, all sorts of things. So I think it is good for us to try to remain hopeful.
I do too. And the thing is the old cliche, it's one step forward and three steps back. And for activists, I think it's easy to get frustrated if you're looking at the short game and not the long game. So, if we're fighting bills that pass in the legislature, we tell our members this is a long game. We have an opportunity to change it down the road. So you always have to keep that in mind. It's not overnight. And if you look at the fight for women to vote, that took a long time.
Yeah, absolutely. So, well, this has been such a pleasure talking to you and learning from you. So I thank you so much for that. Is there anything else you'd like to share with our listeners? I'm going to link, of course, all league info here for anybody that's interested in being a part of it. And like you said, or just being a supporter, but there's also so many different things you do. But if there's anything else you'd like to add, we'd love to hear it.
Just that if you want to get involved in an organization that is not going to require you to go out and advocate for a candidate or a political party, and you want to work on issues, the League of Women Voters is the organization for you. It is so easy to sign up and to get involved in whatever way you would like. If you are passionate about education, for example, we have a statewide education team. There are local education committees depending on the local league. And we fight for public schools. So there's one example. If voting rights matters to you, we're the organization to join, because that is our core mission. But there are other things we work on as well. Natural resources. We have a climate crisis in our country. We have to save the planet. And the league is working on that by pushing solar and electric vehicles. So there are many different things that you can get involved with by joining the League of Women Voters of Florida.
Thank you so much. All right, everybody, I will link that all here. And Patti, thank you so much for joining me on Culture Chat.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
That's all for today's episode. Thanks for listening to Culture Chat and hope you enjoyed the conversation. Please subscribe and rate my podcast. Feel free to leave me suggestions or send an email to mimi@culturechatpodcast.com or follow me on social media at Sifu Mimi Chan on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook.